So during this talk, I'm going to be talking about my choices, but I also want you to think about your choices. The choices that you have made in your practice as well as in your life, and how you are determined to make things move forward in your artwork. So here are some of the artists. These are all the detail shots, and what a variety we had. You know, to actually come across even half of these was just awe-inspiring for me. During the journey process, Petra and I had a lot of discussions. We actually, luckily, Schweinfurt gave us a good amount of time to consider these entries, and we really spent, I think both of us spent a lot of time reading the artist statements, looking at the art, considering what we wanted in or out, comparing each other's lists of, you know, these are the ones I want, these are the ones she wants, and, you know, kind of merging those lists together. So with quilts, you know, we have three different viewpoints. I think about quilts as a three-stage viewing process. And when you walk into a room and see a quilt on the wall, you see it as kind of a painting and a composition, and you're attracted to the color or the value or the drama of the composition. And you get closer and you realize that it's made of fabric and thread and batting, and it has texture, and it's, you know, kind of even more interesting because of that. At least I'm a little biased by that, but I really want to get close. And, you know, some of that detailed structure of how it was pieced together, how it was slashed or burned or stitched or, you know, painted on. Those details come across in fiber art more than, I think, even paintings and sculptures. I think we have a medium that is so versatile and so wonderful to work with that we can take it in any direction. It can be sculptural, it can be a painting-like thing, it can be dyed, it can be slashed and burned, and any other thing you want to do to it. So, you know, those stages have been decided by these artists. They have their pieces and they're making decisions at each stage where you're thinking about composition and your concept and the way you're putting it together, the engineering of it. You're also asking yourself, is this possible? Can I do this? I'm not sure if this is actually the direction I want to go. You know, you're redoing piecing, you're being inspired by mistakes or not inspired, and you have to tear it out and start over again. So, you know, that's something that, you know, if you had a whole host of judges at your shoulder, not just the one that says, I'm an imposter. You know, that you could go on and on and on making decisions that will stop you from doing the actual work, that will stop you from being in the flow of process. So, though we all want to be admired and accepted and you know, you have to first be inside yourself. You have to be in for yourself, and that's about the decisions that you make during the process of making your work. These artists did that, you know, each one of them in their own way. And that's something that I think that this particular show gives us great treasures, because each individual, I really didn't see any repeat techniques or structures, or it felt like every single solution on the wall was a unique piece of art, that it stood on its own and stood with great power. And that's what made it difficult to be a juror, that everything was particularly great. So we choose our medium intentionally. You know, we have chosen this medium as the way that we want to work in our art form. And I think we're the lucky ones as artists, because of its versatility, because of its availability, because of its approachability. You know, it has those connotations in history. It also has that approachability of the warm and wonderful blankets that we used to put on our beds. Even now, using that as a metaphor, the fact that we're putting something soft and powerful on the wall. It's almost a healing, and I take that very seriously. I think that the fact that it's fiber is something that makes it even more powerful than other art forms. So we're the lucky ones, you know. The rest of them, they went the wrong way. So, you know, in being a judge or being a juror, Petra and I both spent a lot of time thinking, and so I would devote about an hour and a half in the mornings looking through maybe 10 or 15 pieces, reading the information about them, thinking about what size they really were. You know, when it says 60 by 60, how do you put that in your head and think about, is this a big piece or it's a small piece? I'm not sure. That's one thing I was surprised about when I came to the show, is that some pieces looked bigger than I expected them to be. Some pieces look smaller than I expected them to be. And that's one of those decisions that you make as an artist, that the size of your piece can actually add information, add value for the viewer. That, you know, if you're doing something intimate and hand-stitched, it doesn't have to be 8 foot big, you know, because that's an intimacy that is immediate in the stitch length and the texture of the cloth and those kinds of things. But if you're doing something that's really bold and forceful, you know, large might be the answer. So I counsel everybody, and myself especially, to think about size and why I'm making my pieces this size. Because I think it can add power to your pieces. And I don't think the answer always is big. I think small is just as powerful. So luckily we had 2 heads. And the process for Petra and I was we would give ourselves a little time, and then we would have a conversation, a Zoom conversation, comparing notes about which pieces we liked and which pieces we wanted to move forward into the in column instead of the out column. And both of us, I think, had the same feeling of we had so many great pieces to choose from. It really was taxing to try to say, oh, can we fit more? You know, how many walls do we have? Can we make it bigger? Like I said, I really wanted to have every single one of those artists on that list, to have as much space as they could possibly have in the gallery. And I wanted to squeeze in some more too. So it was difficult to finally come down to the answer. So one thing about, you know, making choices and asking yourself questions. You know, when I'm working, I'm always asking myself questions. Usually for me, the first step is to have a concept, and it's usually very broad. You know, I saw a leaf fall off the tree, and that's what I want to do. You know? Or it could be, I listened to some politician, and I'm really angry, and that's what I'm going to do. And it doesn't really come with a composition or a feeling of, you know, I've got that image in my head. But it does come with a commitment to the concept. And so assembling the materials, usually they're just raw pieces of cloth. I keep the idea in my mind, and that idea can morph through the process. I know all of you, and when you're doing these quilts, that your pieces can morph as you work on them. They change based on, you know, that scene changed the colors together, or this scene changed something about the composition. So those are the things that I ask myself first when I'm first starting a piece is, can I do this? And will I do this? The commitment level is important because, as we all know, this is a slow art. We can't just, you know, push a button and have it come out of the computer. It takes a long time, and it takes a commitment level that's really important. And I think this quote by Michael Cunningham, persistence, endurance, much of the work we love wouldn't exist if the artist hadn't been spectacularly tenacious. And I think every single one of the quilt artists in this room, that's a quality that we all have, that we are tenacious about our art. So I wanted to go through a little quilt that I worked on that sort of illustrates that idea. My idea for this quilt was basically, there's a river that goes through Memphis, polluted, it's been channelized, it's been disregarded, and there's a conservancy organization that's trying to clean it up and buy land around it so that they can bring it back to its natural state. So I wanted to do a piece about them. And this is usually as far as I go in terms of planning. It's usually a word list, a little, minor sketch, nothing really gridded out, no pattern. And I worked on that for about 6 months. And it was going to be spectacular. It was going to be a masterpiece. And after 6 months, I realized it was a piece of, excuse me. And I threw it under the table. And it was one of those things I really had to ask myself, okay, was my commitment level really there, or is it basically that I was trying to do something above my skill level? Should I still pursue it? Was it worthy of pursuit? And I decided, yes, it was worthy of pursuit. And so I went back to the drawing board and came up with some more ideas of how I could organize the quilt in a fairly diagrammatic way. Nothing really, as you can see, very rough drawing. And I ended up doing it. And so this was another 9 months worth of work. You can see how the river comes in and out of focus and how the community is built around it. So, that's the level I think that sometimes it takes. That you have to believe in your idea, you have to believe in your concept, and you have to pursue it, be tenacious about it. And it's okay if you throw it under the table. That's just part of it. That's just part of the process. And the second thing is composition versus chaos. I am attracted to chaos. I like a lot of detail. I like a lot of mess. And so, a lot of times I'll be working on pieces. This was basically a work in progress piece that I did years ago. And the original piece was really all those triangles sort of floating in black air. And the piece got wonky. It was awful. It looked horrible. And so I had to cut it up and reconfigure it so that those red squares would organize it and keep it stable. But it was an interesting juncture because I really wanted the chaos to be there. And I asked myself all the time about, do we really need under grid? Do we have to have structure in our pieces so that they have a place to rest? That the images and the stitching and the colors have a place to feel comfortable in their environment. And I think that sometimes they can be raw and open and chaotic. But I think that underlying grid or that underlying feeling of support and solidity. Is that a word, solidity? Is really important. So here's another piece that I was working on. This is basically a piece, and you can see 2 versions of it here. And there's a 3rd version, and it keeps changing, and gets bigger, and then it gets smaller, and then it gets cut, and then we all go through this process, right? We all go through this up and down, and backwards and forwards, and cut and shape and redo it again. So I think that's part of the attraction for me of chaos, of being in that thing where I'm not in control, and then the reward of being in control at the end is something that I like. Ask yourselves: Are you chaotic in the beginning, or are you planned and carefully taking step by step? That's just a difference in the work style. So this little story here is about my trip to the dump. My husband and I had cleaned out our garage and put a truckload of stuff in the back of the truck and went to the dump, and they said, go on up the mountain. It was about 100 degrees, and there were bugs and rats and great, it smelled horrible, and this grinder was basically taking all of it and making a milkshake out of it, just grinding and grinding and grinding. Really intimidating, and then I came home. You can't get away from it. I did not put this in the back of the truck. So, it was an eye-opener for me. It was one of those things like, we are all contributors. We all need to be conscious of our contribution to the waste stream. We all need to think about how fabric is being used. We need to think about the fact that, natural cottons and are different than polyesters, and all of those things that we have to think about as responsible artists. So I decided that day that I would start using my scraps and reconfiguring them, putting them back together again, kind of experimenting with overstitching, assembling, and going into a 3D morph mode. Here's it again, I did it again, and I did it again, and I've got a lot of scraps. that underneath the table, perfect place to find more scraps. And I think that exploration of an idea of using scraps and building 3D objects and thinking about how I'm contributing or not contributing to the waste stream is important to me as an artist. So process versus product. This is something I ask all the time. I'm product oriented in my mind. I want something pretty and wonderful at the end, like here's my final piece. But what gives me more joy is being in the process. And so I'm getting more and more to the point where I really want to just keep making, instead of thinking about, this is good enough for Quilt National, or this is good enough for QAQ, or this is good enough for, and I can enter it, and it's going to be great, and I'm going to get a prize, and everybody's going to splat. I'm really back at the first stage of, I just want to do this. I just want to do this every day. And I'm dedicated to it as a pure action. So this is an example of that pure action. It's really, I saw this picture, I took this picture of a piece of plywood that had holes in it. And I thought, that's really interesting, the way that the layering happened. And I started taking more pictures of layered things and thinking about how I could actually use that idea to create a piece. So I started with the shapes with holes, and basically just, random shapes floating in the black space of the cloth, adding more of them and layering them on top of each other, bringing more texture in, filling spaces, thinking about transparency and layers, adding yet more, and ended up with this piece. Now, that was fun. It's not a great piece, but it was so much fun. And it gave me such joy to create it. And it gave me ideas of how I could use some of those stitch techniques on other pieces that might be a little bit better, So I want to encourage you to think about your practice as an artist as joy, not work. That we go to the studio to play, not work. That we're in process rather than thinking about the award we might get, all that silly stuff. So less is more versus more, and more is more. Okay, can I simplify my message? Have I edited out the extraneous? This is one of my challenges in my art career. I tend to really like a lot of detail, and I tend to overdo it and should probably hold back a little bit and try to think about my structures a little more carefully. So I do want to tell you the story of these numbers. I had decided that I was doing a piece on irrational number pi, and so I just started putting numbers down, my numbers, my address, my date of birth, my Social Security number, my kid's birthday, And I thought, I wonder if pi, because it's irrational and it's endless, it's infinite, I wonder if this series of numbers actually shows up in pi. Wouldn't it be cool if, you put your social security number and you're like number 4,500,000 in that pi sequence. But then I actually started working and thinking, what if somebody actually figures this out and they could steal my identity? Sometimes you're a little irrational yourself. But so I struggle to be minimalist. This is as close as I get to minimalism, where I'm thinking about new languages and how we use symbols for conversations. We use, especially now with this little thumb thing that we use, put in smiley faces instead of saying, yes, I do agree. So these are the pieces that I kind of play with in that regard. And love here, pretty simple topic, right? So, a minimalist way, this is as minimalist as I can get, and then, the real me is over here, where complication becomes the focus. And like I said, I have a lot of scraps, so I started making a scrap curtain, and then I started using those scraps in pieces where I started putting them together in a standard 1-inch, 2-inch, and 4-inch grid, and then overstitching it. You can see that I'm not a plain spoken person. Here's another one. This one started being 3D, which was even more fun for me. So I take my old quilts. I take the quilts that didn't work, or I take my old quilts that are sort of aged out, or what was I thinking when I did that? And that's my raw material now. And it's getting to the point where I'm getting a little bit closer and closer to the edge of like the ones that might be a little more precious. And so the next thing is fearless versus timid. I want you to ask yourself, are you fearless or are you timid when you're working? What questions do you ask yourself when you're working? Can I be fearless in my decisions? Is there a point when something becomes too precious to touch anymore? So I find this is a perfect quote for Amy Stillman, who is a video artist. I finally realized over the last 30 years that what I was interested in was the transformation of something into something else, and then into something else. So it keeps moving. It keeps moving. And I think that's where my practice lies right now. Here's an example of that. These are two quilts. One of them, this white one on the left, a quilt national piece. And then this black one that was one of those dark periods of my life. And I thought, I'm going to put them together. And I thought, if I could merge them together, it would be a stronger statement. And I could play with the idea of perception and importance in life. So I took the black one and I stuck it over the white one and put these white pieces of paper on there, thinking that if I cut the holes in the black one, it wouldn't be as precious as the white one, which had gotten some acclaim. And I kept doing that, but realized that I couldn't do that. I had to actually cut the holes. And that day was pretty exciting, how many square holes can you cut into a quilt and feel like you still have a piece to work with? And it was exciting to me and also challenging. So mortising in those squares and shapes into the black quilt to make it set up. I stitch around the edge so that they're basically butted together. And, turned it upside down, turned it 90 degrees, turned it another 90 degrees, turned it upside down again, cut some more holes, added more stitching, and ended up with this. I don't think this one's done, and it may completely morph. It might end up getting cut in half and started over again. But this process, again, it was joy. I didn't have to, I felt compelled. And every time I came into the studio, it was yet another square I could cut or another one that I could experiment with the composition. So here's another version of that, controlled chaos versus chaos is in control. That left one nonsense is a whole cloth quilt that I designed. It's a cheater cloth basically, so I had those black squares and shapes printed onto white fabric, and then overstitched them, created a piece called Nonsense. And then this piece was just a complete failure from the beginning to the end. And I put it on the out column, and it was on the sort of on the table. And I thought, one day it sort of hit the Nonsense piece, and I thought, these kind of go together. And started experimenting with mortising them together, kind of playing with that sutured look of the stitching, cutting holes. This was a difficult hole to cut. Every little, I thought, what am I doing? And here's bluster. So again, process versus product. I didn't really care what it ended up looking like, although I'm pretty happy with the way it looks. It really was about the process and pushing it to the point where I felt like I was actually saying something in the piece that was more honest than the other two pieces that were put together. Here's another total failure piece of crap. I worked on it for, months, did all this piecing, had this brilliant idea that it was going to be all about passwords because, how they make me crazy. And I said, almost, as soon as I had it to the point where it was almost finished, it was out. And at the same time I was doing full coverage, because when we were experimenting with being isolated because of COVID, I thought, maybe we could express ourselves through full coverage masks and be still protected. And so I made a number of them, probably, 40 or so, out of quilts that were older quilts and aged out quilts, and cut that thing up and make some masks out of it. And then those masks became this piece. So, the morphing of the idea is my point. Seeing something, trying something, having some very solid thing at the beginning in terms of the thought process, but then moving towards it in increments. I didn't know that I was going to make this background until I had 5 masks and had to figure out what they were going to do. I didn't know that I was going to make those masks with the holes until I had one that was solid and needed a hole. So those pieces sort of come step at a time. So comfort versus challenge is another thing that I ask myself all the time. Can I do with less? How many people here have a really great studio? Lots of them. Little pieces of, you've got your perfect sewing machine. You've got a stash in the closet. Come on, you admit it. There's a stash in the closet. Those kinds of things are really comfort zone. Those things that you know how to do. You know how to piece them, or you know how to dye it, or you know how to stitch it. And so my challenge always is to put myself in a position where I'm not comfortable. And I did this through a residency in Virginia, where they gave you this huge white box, which is supposedly your studio. It's got nothing in it. And I was determined not to bring very much with me. So I brought canvas, muslin, batting, black thread, and a few scraps of fabric, and some ink. That's all I had. And I thought, well, I've got ink, I've got canvas, throw the ink on the canvas. And I'm going to do something about ink blots and thinking about how we respond to ink blots. And looking at how, and this is all a discovery process. It's not about, I drew this landscape line and this is where the trees are. It's about discovery and responding to what's already there. Thinking about texture and depth and how your stitching can change the surface of the cloth. And some more stitching. And some more stitching. I tend to stitch a lot. And then a finish. So I made a lot of this cloth, and I ended up having enough cloth that I could make these beasts out of them. And the beast project came in about the 2016 election, and how I felt like there were a lot of people just sort of following blindly. So this is part of the herd. Here's another uncomfortable position. I was in a workshop about woodcuts, and they gave us each artist got a 4x8 sheet of MDF plywood and a knife set, and said carve. And no instruction, just carve. I'd never done a woodcut before. I created this cartoon on the left there. We were printing to fabric, which was what I was responding to. And so I made a quilt top for it, and we did some sourcing at Goodwill stores to find other substrates that I could use for my prints. And then this is my woodcut on the right. And we layered them up on the street, and put layers down after inking the board. And then the steamroller just rolled right over it. And then you would take all that fabric, the felt pad and things would come up, and you would pull the print. And it was so much fun. Oh my God, you have to do this. You have to do this. Everybody has to do this. I ended up, I think we pulled 12 or 15 of my pieces, and used that in a lot of pieces afterwards. So this is part of those prints that I did. This is the back of one of the pieces I did with those prints. And there's, I think that's the Quilt National again. And now I cut it up, and I'm thinking about 3D. So it morphs. I was lucky enough last year to spend a month in Japan at a residency. I got a studio that gave me this, and this is my work chair on the right. And they had a board over two, what do they call those triangle things? Yeah, anyway, a board. That was my desk. That board was kind of wobbly, and they had a sewing machine. They said it would do free motion stitching, and I thought, great, I don't have to ship my sewing machine. Got there and didn't have a free motion foot on it. And I said, there's not a free motion foot on this machine, and that's what I'll need. And she pointed to the foot pedal. And she said, well, there's a pedal there, it's free, it's a foot, and that, you can freely put your foot on it. So I couldn't sew. Talk about being out of my comfort zone. That was a big one for me, and I had to really ponder a little bit. I had also at the same time threw in this rice paper roll that I'd had for ages in my closet, thinking, Japan, rice paper, yeah. And luckily I did, because I spent the next 4 weeks drawing. And I'm not a great drawer. I'm a cartoony kind of drawer. I kind of respond to pattern and shapes and kind of play with ideas. But I was doing it, based on things that I had seen, the house across the street and the market that we went to and the trees that were weird and all kinds of different things that responded to it while I was in Japan, and ended up with a 14-foot scroll, which was really a lot of fun. And I actually, I feel more comfortable drawing now. So here's the thing. Am I doing this for myself or for my audience? Can I laugh at myself? I've learned how to laugh at myself. I know I can do that. But I still have this sort of tinkling in the back of like, what will people think about this? That little urge that you want to please people, you want to be recognized, you want to get in the show, all those things that sort of rumble in my head every so often. I've been able to clear most of them out, and I want you to think about that. Because I really feel like we have to be more playful. That this is we are an unstitched society. We need some healing, and we need some more joy. And I think that's something that that as artists we I think I'm compelled to do it. I'm compelled to make work that brings joy or brings thought to the wall. And I think, one of those things where you feel like, see if I can get this to work here without, here's my yes man. I made a cloud of yes men. There were about 12 of them. So you run through and just sort of pull their chains and feel like you're in control. And then these smilers greet me at the door every time I go into the studio. They're really easy to make, so I make a lot of them. And then these guys, I made these guys thinking about how worms would look if they were singing. It was just one of those things, a nature trail, that I saw some worms. I thought, if I put their head up, I wonder what they do. So I made these, and then somebody walked in the studio and they said, "Oh, you're doing a series on penises." Well, not quite. They're singing worms. Don't you see that? So, that kind of joy, that kind of, happiness, I love having that as a counterpoint to this anxiety that I have watching the news. So here's fruit. That was done using somebody else's painter's drop cloth. I picked it up and I said, "Can I have this?" And he said yes. So I made some innies and outies on it and created a whipped cream sculpture that was really fun and intuitive. And these are the beasts. This is the herd. And they're going to be visiting here next year, upstairs. Do your expectations set you up for failure? You have these dreams of like, this is what it looks like. And then when it doesn't look like that, do you stop? Or do you react? And then, have I worked hard enough or gone deep enough? This is one of mine, where, I'm intent on making a message, intent on making a communication that is really serious and heavy. And I think about how deep have I gone inside myself? How deep have I gone to the truth of that thought? And have I been honest about portraying it? That honesty is really important in art, that you have to be brave to put your work out there. You have to be brave to be able to say what you want to believe. And that's something that I ask myself all the time. Am I hiding behind technique? Am I hiding behind embellishment? Am I hiding behind color? Am I really true to my purpose? So those are questions you have to ask yourself. I teach stitching, and here's something that I've learned about teaching stitching, is that almost all of my students come in saying, "I can't do this," or "I'm uncomfortable doing this," or "I've never done this," or "I've not felt like I could ever do this on one of my quilts, because I would certainly ruin it," And when I see the work, and my effort during those classes is to loosen everybody up and not have expectations, and really start thinking about the hand of the artist and how the texture of the cloth can be affected by your stitch, and how stitch is a really powerful element for quilts. I think it's underused. I'm very biased about that. And I think there's a lot of things that could be even more powerful with a stitch that is intentional. And so the thing that I see with stitchers, the people who are uncomfortable with stitching, is if you say you can't do this, if you think that you can't do this, then you often end up right here. It stops you. And you can't, you don't proceed further, or you don't think about, well, if I screw up the first 20, there's always the 21st. And I think that's something that I've come to in my artwork, that it's all It's all raw material. It's not final until I say it is. And so I'll try things that really fail, and then try them again, and it's better the second time. And I'm trying to be more fearless. So I think, speaking to that idea of, have you gone deep enough? Have you thought your process out? Have you felt like you've been honest with your work? Or are you hiding behind a technique? Are you hiding behind something that doesn't have the gravitas that it might have? That's where the journey of your life can take you if you are more and more honest with what you're doing. So this is another one of my practices. This is, in addition to the isolation chamber, I seek things that calm me down. And I found this tree out on a nature hike. It's called the black locust tree. It was used by farmers for hedges because it has these thorns that are lethal. And so I started wrapping them with my thread ends, and it'll bring you to the present moment. It's a very good practice because every time you go around, you can nick yourself. And these guys are lethal. They hurt. So anyway, I'm asking you, and one of your questions is, what do you use to calm the craziness? Because I have this feeling that I'm running out of time, and there's not enough hours in the day, not enough days in the week, not enough weeks in the month, not enough years in my years. So, I'm running full speed, and I feel like every scrap I make is a time capsule of my effort, and I like the fact that they are accumulating. And I still want to be like this. I still want to think that I'm a superhero inside and that I can do anything I want, that I can put anything on my body, that I can make anything and make it feel like it's an intentional thing.